So welcome to our latest webinar on the Modern CISO Compliance Stack, Framework, Automation and AI. I'm your host, Lucy Montague, Head of Marketing at CoreStream GRC. And today we welcome Paul Anders, who featured on our most recent webinar, Beyond AI Chatbots, Intelligence First GRC, Your Board Can Trust, which you can find on the CoreStream GRC YouTube channel. So let's kick off with some introductions on both yourself and your organisation. And we'll begin with Tom, as you're joining a CoreStream GRC webinar for the first time. So if you kick us off, and then we can follow with Anders. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Tom Cornelius. I'm the founder of the Secure Controls Framework, also a senior partner at Compliance Forge. Essentially, I've been doing GRC for about the last 20 plus years.
Thank you, Tom. And could you just give us a little background into the secure control frameworks for those who might not understand or know about it?
Sure. So the Secure Controls Framework, commonly called the SCF, is an open source meta framework, so a framework of frameworks. It's been around since went live in 2018, and it's used in some of the biggest organizations, governments, around. Generally, you find it in medium to enterprise environments, but over 1,500 controls, 200 different laws, regulations, and frameworks, and it's free for any organization to use.
And your strapline is hard compliance, which I think is very nice for this conversation, so this should be good. Anders, if we move over to you, what's your current role, your previous background, and where you're currently working?
Well, maybe starting from my previous background, I don't think I have as many years of experience as Tom. Most haven't, but I've also been working in the GRC space for the last 20 plus years, both as Chief Risk Officer in global companies struggling with the requirements for global regulated clients that are imposing third-party requirements. And then my two latest role was a partner in two of the big fours as partner for GRC, and my current role is now co-founder of SANNOS AI, trying to solve some of the challenges we're going to talk about today.
Thank you, Anders. And then to round us off, we've got Paul. Paul, can you give us a bit into your background?
Sure. Thank you, Lucy. So I'm the GRC Strategy Director at CoreStream. By background, I've been in the GRC space 25, 26 years, something like that. Primarily working within the Big Four, so former Big Four partner, focused on risk and compliance frameworks and helping organizations address their needs. And then I've gradually moved more into the technology side of enabling those frameworks.
Amazing. So we do have a wealth of experience on the line, so it should be a good conversation. As stated, make sure to include your questions that we can hopefully get to at the end. But in the meantime, we're going to kick off. So we'll start with Tom. Tom, how does the SCF help security teams have more meaningful conversations with auditors, regulators, and business stakeholders?
So this is where in most modern organizations, you find that it's beyond just ISO 27001 or NIST CSF. It's a blend of different laws, regulations, and frameworks. You rarely find, say, a hospital that just does HIPAA. They've got PCI, maybe they've got 80171, they've got state and possibly even international data privacy laws. So you have to essentially have the right control set to address the security, compliance, and resilience needs of that organization. And this is where the scalability of the Secure Controls Framework allows you to address the must-haves and the nice-to-haves for that security program. And that's really where it helps have more meaningful risk dialogue from the built-in risk weighting of each control. Because if you really look at a control, they're not all equally weighted. No one would reasonably argue that not having a firewall is equally as important as not having annual refresher training. So, that's where, assigning a relative weight to a control can also help from the idea of, is this something that we're able to essentially accept risk if the control is deficient, versus something that would be unacceptable.
Very interesting. Thank you, Tom. Anders, What do you believe is keeping CISOs up at night, and why?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's regulations as such. I think what's keeping CISOs awake is more, when they know what the risk is and how to mitigate it. They're working in huge organizations. So my own experience and my friends that are CISOs, it's more around the assurance around whether things are actually in place, and obviously also being able to evidence that to their clients and third parties and assessors, to be able to demonstrate that regulations can somewhat easily be translated into controls. The challenge, as Tom alluded to, is when you have tons of regulations or frameworks at one time, one client asking for one and another, while the frameworks has evolved in terms of size and numbers. The CISO teams haven't. They're still understaffed heavily, and they're basically outnumbered by far, considering the work they have to really do. And I think I don't only think, I do know that that's stressing out a lot of CISOs today.
That's very interesting. And as we're just running a poll for our audience around what's keeping them up at night, and we've got 80% who are voting for third-party risk and vendor risk, and then the second is proving value to the board. And then alongside those other points were increasing regulatory requirements, managing multiple compliance frameworks, as Tom has alluded to, lack of resources and budget, which is something Anders has just spoken to, and then keeping pace with AI-driven threats, which is just across the board. So that is very interesting. We'll leave that running for a couple more minutes so we can get the last of the votes in. And then we move into Paul. Paul, what's your thoughts on what's keeping CISOs up at night?
So from my point of view, there's in terms of keeping CISOs up at night, in terms of the bit of warning signs around the compliance program being more of a checkbox exercise, I think. So in terms of, for me, there'll be kind of the metrics focused on activity and not outcomes. So maybe they're tracking percentages of policies reviewed or training completion rates, rather than risk incidents avoided or time to remediate control failures. It might be that policies exist, but they're not actually operationalized in terms of those areas. Training might be generic and repetitive, and so those elements are very much for me about the same e-learning modules, regardless of role or business change or anything, is being pushed out. That's an example of it being a checkbox exercise. Risk assessments are static and templated. There's no linkage between compliance findings and the business decisions. So the compliance findings is all over here, audits are done and they're logged, but then the business continue to make decisions separately over here. And so interestingly, I think also vendor and third-party due diligence is typically a one-time gate. You've got the initial onboarding, the questionnaire is completed, no continuous monitoring, reassessments, and so forth. Another indication of kind of checkbox. And I think often controls testing is self-attested rather than being independently verified. Again, another checkbox alarm bell. Alongside the fact that often regulatory change management is very manual and lagging, which comes back to some of the points we've already talked about with regards to their kind of bringing frameworks together in one place. I think one of the biggest alarm bells for a checkbox compliance function would be about board or exec reporting being backwards looking and reassuring by design, with very little narrative on kind of residual risk appetite or emerging exposure. And I think, really the tone is get it done for the audit is a checkbox mentality, rather than let's understand our exact exposure and what that means to the business. So to me, all those things combined are what demonstrates a checkbox compliance program for CISOs. But and some of those things may actually be keeping them up at night as well, in terms of how they feel about those areas.
Well, one quick thing on the third party risk, which is kind of interesting, is that I think a lot of companies they view it a little bit contemptuous as an unfunded mandate. you've got essentially sometimes 200, 300 questionnaires that come down that they're not getting paid for. That this is essentially a sunk cost that the company has to review, and they're being asked questions that are far more invasive than what the even what the host company the prime contractor is doing internally. So I think we've seen that oftentimes you have third-party risk management teams go a little bit rogue. So if they're just doing ISO 27001, but they are making an incredibly robust questionnaire to make them sound tough or to justify their existence, that are asking for third parties to do far more secure practices than they're doing themselves. And I think that's a little bit companies see that and they find that frustrating.
Thank you, Tom. Sticking with you, what's the biggest misconception that boards and executives still have about compliance programs?
I think right now, from a misconception, is that they can kind of keep kicking the can down the road. You see that sometimes with different CISOs that have a 18-month or 2-year tenure. They come in, make changes, move stuff down the road without really moving the needle to make things better. When you start looking at some of the new requirements coming out of like NYDFS or CCPA, now you're actually having annual attestations. So those CISOs are actually having to attest to the security of their programs. So I think the misconception is they can no longer just not progress anything. Now it's going to become much more common that the CISOs are going to have skin in the game and have personal legal liability to fix their programs.
Interesting times ahead. We're going to release our next poll here to our audience, which is around their current compliance program. The question being, which statement best describes your compliance program today? Is it mostly spreadsheet-driven, some automation in place, multiple tools with limited integration, a centralized GRC platform, or continuous compliance/monitoring approach? And that leads us to our question for you, Paul. Everyone agrees that compliance should be automated, but why are so many organizations in 2026 still relying on spreadsheets and manual evidence collection?
That's a really, really great question, and one we see all the time with kind of vision of getting to automation, but in reality, it's hard for an organization to rapidly move that dial. And I think there's a number of factors. So I just run through a few of them. So spreadsheets. So you're number one there on the list for that poll. I've got a near zero marginal cost to start. So no procurement cycle, no vendor risk assessment, no budget approval needed. It's there for you to use. But then that's kind of the technology's there, but actually other driving factors are things like control environments are fragmented. They're bespoke. They are multiple control, risk taxonomies, different controls libraries, different reporting hierarchies for different purposes across an organization, which, that could be writ large. It could be just also within IT and the CISO space. And so that means that, you've not got one driver from a kind of standard way of doing things, and therefore automation doesn't flow naturally. Coupled with that is ownership is often split across silos, across different functions and parts of the organization. Evidence requirements also often move faster, shift faster than systems can be reconfigured. So, for example, if there's a new field you need in DORA for reporting purposes, it's quicker to use a spreadsheet, add a column, than it is to go through a configuration change on an enterprise software. And so I think one of the other major driving factors is that people have scar tissue from previous attempts to automate. And that means, they tried to do something either in their current role or their previous organization 5 or 10 years ago, was poorly configured, under-adopted. And so they've developed institutional skepticism as to why invest again? Why not just keep going with the manual process? Auditors and regulators still accept spreadsheets as evidence. It doesn't have to be a fully digitized system in terms of providing evidence. And so couple that with the perceived flexibility of spreadsheets versus the rigidity of platforms drives people to just go with the path of least resistance. And kind of coming down to kind of business wider decisions, approvals, budgets, the automation return on investment is hard to quantify up front. The business case generally rests on avoided risk and freed up time in terms of efficiencies, so full-time equivalent time, which both can be contested or discounted by finance versus the platform's very tangible price tag. So this kind of demonstrating the value of automation is often the challenge as well. So all those things combined is people have an aspiration for automation, but there's a lot of hurdles to overcome to actually get it out there in terms of some perceptions, some organizational challenges, as well as just it's easier sometimes to use semi-manual routes to do those things.
Well, and on that, it's easier to do it when no one's checking. It's just once there's penalties involved. A good example is with the U.S. Department of Defense with the Spurs vendor issue. Companies that were attesting to perfect scores now a year or a few years later are now being audited. And having that type of evidence, likely doesn't exist on an Excel spreadsheet where, could lead to significant fines. But if you had it within a GRC platform, you could pull up, reasonable evidence, then that is, justifiable. So those type of scenarios will kind of come out where it's from a financial liability perspective, Excel spreadsheets, while they're great for a point in time, they're really not evidence-based.
Thank you, Tom. Paul, looking at the data from the poll, it looks like the top performer is the multiple tools with limited integration. We've got a 50% vote here. The next at 33% is mostly spreadsheet driven. And then at 17%, there is just some automation in place. Do you think that reflects the wider market from the conversations that you've been having with different enterprise and small to medium businesses?
I think so. I mean, particularly within IT and the CISO world, there is often digitalization already in place. So there's going to be platforms in there in terms of the various different ones. So yes, I think that reflects the case. There is very rarely a singular solution that's bringing everything together. Often things are being purchased via different stakeholders over the years. And then not thought about that holistic integrated GRC approach. So hence you've got the kind of multiple systems, no integration, often with overlaps in terms of capabilities between those various systems as well. So I think that definitely reflects kind of reality we're seeing out there.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And then if we move from one extreme of the Excel spreadsheet to the other in 2026, which is AI, which is something everyone is very interested in. Anders, how do CISOs distinguish between AI capabilities from marketing hype?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question, Lucy. And it's terribly difficult when the market is swamped with what at least I call light AI, which is in the chatbot league. I normally, and this is both to global kind of professional services company, but also regulated industry. I just had the same question actually from a UK-based bank yesterday morning, where the regulators are now adopting something which is equivalent to the Resilience Act in Europe, named DORA, which imposes quite severe requirements when it comes to showing evidence of compliance. I have 4 questions. I normally say to them, number 1, does your AI or whatever you're looking at, does it execute the compliance assessment work, or is it just generating text like a chatbot? Does it have explainability? So can it actually explain why it's resonated like it did with an audit trail? which, by the way, is also a requirement within the AI Act, but many AI solution doesn't do it. And very importantly, would an assessor or an auditor produce a similar output and consistently, so it doesn't answer one thing one day and another thing? And lastly, and this is normally one that makes the trick, would you be able to, or would you actually share that to regulators or assessors or your board and put your reputation at risk? Which is probably the questions everyone should be starting with. So those are the four questions I would say a CISO should use when they're evaluating. There's so many nice user interface solutions out there, but behind that sits a simple LLM model, which shouldn't be considered a reliable audit-grade AI solution.
This is really helpful, Anders, because you're talking to the point of AI governance, and this is something that is cropping up more and more as we look at things like token credits, things being switched off, how we can enable junior staff members, as well as teaching senior leadership. And we actually have a guide and several stories on our website that talk to AI governance, so please do check it out. I wanted to follow up with this. So if AI is reviewing evidence and recommending outcomes, where does human judgment still matter most when it comes to governance, risk and compliance, Anders?
Well, AI should definitely not replace professionals. Maybe sometime out in the future, none of us imagined that AI could do what it can now, but it should replace repetitive analysis. So read evidence, reasons, validate controls and documentation findings, consistency. But it's the human that sits with the oversight across the organization. AI is intelligence, but it also only knows what it knows. So we normally say for SANNOS AI, consider it the first review. You need a skilled practitioner, someone who knows the organizations and knows the risk to use the data to drive decision. But with that said, that is that when you get 80% of the assessment and control work automated, there's a lot of time freed out, as Paul also alluded to, which you can then spend on driving changes, support the business, which we all know is something CISOs, as other GRC professionals, are often blamed not to do. But blamed to spend most of the time on finding issues and gap rather than helping it. So for sure, human is needed, and AI is an enabler for allowing them to actually do more to change and mitigate risk, rather than following up on assurance and evidence of compliance.
So real quick on that, I'd like to kind of bring up and kind of simplify in some ways the difference between generative AI. And then what I'd like to consider more pattern matching. Generative AI and GRC tends to be garbage. So I think companies that are essentially trying to find, an easy way to write policy standards, procedures, and just other, evidence artifacts are really doing themselves a disservice, because if those won't withstand external audit, because no one actually wrote it, it doesn't reflect what's going on. But when you look at something, something like with SANNOS, is more pattern matching. And sorry to simplify it, but the ability to actually analyze documentation, find specific evidence down at the control or assessment objective level, and present that to a GRC professional or an auditor in a way that is justifiable. That's the type of stuff that you can save 80% of labor costs by automating that process. Because quite literally, paying a few $100s an hour for a person to do a control F on a PDF and find a keyword and make that note is incredibly wasteful. Where a solution, this is where AI can really pay for itself, is by actually presenting that on a silver platter to someone who can then go do the final human review and make sure that it actually does meet the intent of the requirement.
So let me add on to that, and thank you, Tom. Let me give you just a few use cases with intelligence AI automations like SANNOS. The companies we work with, when they're doing a full assessment like a full framework. In the old days, traditionally human, even with chatbots, would often take 100 to 150 hours on that, so 4 to 6 weeks roughly. With an intelligent solution, you can basically, if you have your evidence stack ready, you can do it in a few hours. Of course, then you need the interpretation and the human oversight. Reading complex ICT contracts as another kind of a need, especially in Europe and in UK with the third-party risk requirements coming in, can easily take 3 to 4 days. Those outsourcing contracts are complex. Intelligence AI can do it in 3 to 8 minutes, reading 300 pages of ICT outsourcing contract, finding evidence across multiple appendixes and explaining exactly what is there, what is missing, and how potentially you should rewrite your evidence package. And that's really the difference. Traditional LLMs, as they're good for chatting, they're not good for compliance. Use them for chatbots. Don't use them for your compliance. You will suffer eventually if you haven't kind of recognized that or concluded that yourself already. It's a completely different use case. And that's dangerous these days because some companies are trying and relying on it with basically the risk of their companies.
Well, and real quick, when you kind of look at the broader picture, traditionally, if you're going to have an assessment, the rule of thumb has always been about 1 hour per control or per requirement to be able to do an assessment. And if you look at that slice of a pie of labor, about 70% of the time was essentially documentation review, 20% was interviewing, and 10% was about 20% examination, and about 10% interviewing. If you look at that 70% of that pie that you can then automate, if you have about an 80% solution leveraging AI, that can we've calculated it can drop the overall cost of an assessment down by about 50 to 60%, depending on the level of efficiency of the of the AI. So that's a massive cost savings and time savings. Again, something that could take months could be down to a matter of days or weeks, which is again, everything is about time and money.
And just to make this super clear, so Anders, obviously you saw a gap in the market in regards to the fact that you are from Big Four, your team are Big Four, you're all GRC experts, and you created this AI solution backed by your knowledge. And then you've added on that additional layer with the secure control framework to really give it that high quality, as opposed to like a generic LLM that's free on open source, which could be hallucinating, which is incredibly scary. And then the compliance officer is accountable for the data that's being pumped out. So Tom, my question is to you. When you first looked at SCF and saw the AI capabilities, what did you think?
I saw the potential right away. And one of the issues that and anyone who's been in GRC for long enough and read different laws, regulations, and frameworks is that some are written very, very well. Some are complete garbage. And that's the issue. If you take a garbage requirement and you feed that into an LLM, you're going to get garbage because it's trying to understand a very poorly worded. Maybe it was written by a committee of lawyers. Again, whatever the reason is, it makes it very hard to identify. One thing with the SCF, we have it's close to 6,000 catalog of assessment objectives. So very specific criteria that could be 2 or 3 assessment objectives used to determine if a control is met. And that level of granularity, we found testing with SANNOS is really what matters to, if you can answer at the assessment objective level, now you're having much more justifiable, evidence to say that requirement is met versus just trying to read the base requirement coming from a law, regulation, or framework that you look at HIPAA. HIPAA's 30-something years old, and it's got very nebulous requirements on certain things, and that's hard for AI to interpret. And Anders, I'll let you jump on that one.
No, that's right. That's also actually that's kind of a prerequisite for AI to be efficient. As for human, imagine a young, just graduated person coming in. you give them a framework where everything is written high level. How on earth should they be able to assess whether you're compliant or not? So we often, with AI, also upgrade frameworks unless we can convince them, obviously, to use the secure control framework if it's within the cyber and resilience space. So that is absolutely true. Again, an AI doesn't know what it doesn't know. So without having that knowledge and insight, it's not valuable, and it wouldn't either unless you have 15 plus years of experience as an assessor. Then you can do that. So fully agree, Tom.
And then Anders, just to get a market pulse check from you, because obviously you're speaking to so many different companies about AI usage. From our polling, we can see that 50% have a limited production use, 33% are evaluating use cases, and then 17% are just not using AI today. Do you think that's reflective of what's happening in the market? Is everyone falling behind, or is there still time?
I would actually say they're doing the right thing. There's so few solutions which bring reliable AI, so I can understand that they're not adopting this for control and compliance with the limited kind of players in the market. I do see a shift, actually, and I also do see a shift, of course, from our clients, where it's very easy to quantify both the compliance benefits, but also the financial return on investment. There's so many that have burned a lot of money on LLM models without actually having a clue of what they got out of it, except a lot of fun and some weird images. So I do see a change within the last 6 to 12 months. And we do see client after a very small proof of concept, just one framework, rapidly right now working with a global technology firm who started out with just wanted a few frameworks. Within 2 weeks, they basically came with 18 frameworks. And then they wanted cross-mapping. Obviously, that's where I then recommend secure control framework, because they see that benefit. Sending out self-assessment to teams within the organizations who are not cyber or GRC professionals brings uncertainty. But imagine the amount of work. We're talking about layers and layers of hierarchy and teams sitting out in the organization. Actually, just as late as last week, for not IT controls, financial controls, SANNOS broke, I guess from our point of view, the record in terms of potentially saving a client more than 20 million euros a year for assessment work repetitively with a fraction of the cost. So the business cases are coming, and companies are starting to have the governance in place, as you rightly say, Lucy, which is a prerequisite for engaging with any firm providing AI solutions. And then they need to get a success stories. If you read statistics, McKinsey and others, more than 9 out of 10 of all AI proof of concepts fail. And basically because they're not thought through, and because they're using chatbots as the underlying kind of model, which just doesn't work.
Well, and building on that idea too, is that some AI native GRC platforms or solutions that can work great for a small startup who's only working in AWS or Azure, where it's able to pull telemetry and say, hey, you're compliant with these different requirements. That's not a reality when you have companies that are hybrid or they're on premise. It becomes much more difficult, and this is where an AI solution that has to actually read and understand evidence is much more important. That's one reason that that we really like what SANNOS has and recommend it to them, because it comes down to it's more than just telemetry. From a continuous monitoring perspective, it's like great. You can see how many different endpoints are running the proper configuration, but that's only a very, very small slice of overall what matters to a GRC program. It also matters to the stuff that a machine can't read natively, which requires essentially a solution that is trained to read it and then report on it and then have a human review it. to then report up. Because again, it's going to that aspect of, you look at DORA, you look at NYDFS, CCPA, and others, that there is legal liability associated with making assumptions.
Thank you, Tom. The next question is posed to all of you. So let's imagine a CISO walks into the room and says, I have too many frameworks, too many assessments, too many spreadsheets, and not enough people. What would each of you put into their ideal compliance stack to solve that problem? We'll kick off with Paul.
Thanks, Lucy. I think looking at the, too many assessments, too many frameworks, too many spreadsheets, not enough people, my blunt advice would be the CISO doesn't have a tools problem or a framework problem. They've got a mapping and automation problem. So fix the control to framework mapping once, automate the evidence collection continuously, and prioritize the assessment effort by actual risk. And that combination will turn not enough people into enough people doing the right work.
Short and sweet, I like that. Tom, what about you?
I would agree with Paul. It's just, if you're looking at it from a siloed perspective, it can be overwhelming, and it's changing the mindset and actually using a meta framework that can meet all of those requirements. You essentially assess once and report many, from that concept of being able to demonstrate conformity with multiple different laws, regulations, and frameworks. That's the efficient way to do it.
And then just not to repeat what Tom and Paul did, but it's almost self-funding. Imagine the amount of work you're taking out. Well, obviously, if you're getting new framework requirements, that's new. But then as a CISO, you have two options: give up or hide, or get fired if you don't comply. That's basically what's happening over and over again. But of course, if you give new tasks, then you should ask for additional budget. But otherwise, there's plenty of budget available if you're running it manually and duplicating efforts over and over again. It's tapping into that. It's working smart. That would be funding the entire transformation. So it's actually, as I've said just recently to a CFO, it's a cash flow delay of a few months, which doesn't even give a blip in the budget or the P&L. So I think that's really where CISOs should go, and compliance professionals, instead of being caught up in trying to get away with, and not trying to get away. They can always do it, but getting trapped in using light AI solutions.
Thank you, Anders. So, Paul, let's say the CISO does as you say. What's one metric or perhaps one dashboard view that CISO should be taking to the board to demonstrate the health of this brand new compliance program?
Really, really good question. And obviously everybody loves dashboards and metrics. So to me, there's no single bullet or metric. If I had to pick one view, I'd look at it as a risk exposure trend versus control effectiveness, and not a point in time compliance score. I'll explain why. So the most defensible metric is time to remediate weighted by risk severity. So what I mean by that is how long critical versus low findings sit open, trended over quarters. And that tells the board more than 100 green, amber, red tiles, because it shows the organization where they actually close risk, not just identify it. So that beats, and why that beats the kind of I'm percentage compliant or audit pass rate, because really they're lagging, binary, easily gamed metrics, because you would say I'm 98% compliant, but you're still carrying 3 of the most dangerous unpatched risks for 400 days. So time to remediate, severity weighted, exposes that exactly that gap, i.e. what exposure does the organization have. So that dashboard view would operationalize it well. So a quadrant or a trend line plotting the number of open findings on the x-axis against an age of open findings weighted by severity on the y. And the board can instantly see whether the trajectory is improving, so fewer, younger, lower severity backlog, or were we degrading a growing pile of aging critical items. And that's essentially helping the board understand in a very simple view your risk exposure. Now, If I'm allowed to go for more than one metric, I then pair that with a supporting number like the percentage of control failures with a recurring root cause. So that would essentially saying, are we fixing things or are we learning? Because just keep fixing and repeating the same things, you're not learning what the root cause is and therefore addressing that underlying problem. And so what makes all of that board appropriate rather than operational is it's about presenting that on a 2-3 year trend. Yes, it's going to take time to build up, but don't go for single quarter snapshots. Boards care about trajectory and risk appetite alignment, not what's going on in the noise this month. And what will frame it really well with directors is we don't manage compliance by counting controls. We manage it by how fast we close the gap between the risk being found and the risk being fixed. That reframes compliance from a cost center optic to an exercise about risk velocity conversation, which is really what boards respond to. Now, there is one caveat to all of this. The metric is only as good as your finding identification rigor. So if the underlying risk assessment is weak, so go back to my earlier comments about checkbox exercises and the warning signs of it, then a clear remediation trend can mask an under-detection problem. So it's worth making sure you have some kind of secondary finding source diversity indicator. So where did our findings come from? Internal audit, external audit, self-identified, incident triggered. So where do all those findings come from? Because you want to make sure you've got kind of a good spread. So we're not ending up in this kind of poor underlying risk assessment, which then actually shows more of a positive light than reality in terms of those metrics I've talked about.
Well, real quick on that, I agree with what Paul is saying, and this is where AI is actually going to make it more difficult. And the current org structures, a lot of companies only complicates it. So if you have a CISO who's reporting to basically the CIO in a lot of organizations, and you're reporting that the CIO is horrible at his job of keeping things patched, especially with known exploitable vulnerabilities, KEVs, which are going to be very commonly reported, that becomes a really big problem because you're essentially throwing your boss under the bus. So that's a systemic issue within this. But one thing that we've kind of found is from a board perspective, the board wants to know, are we secure, compliant, and resilient? And be able to then answer that question, with, granular control level, evidence. So you can see what has actually changed in the last, month or so. But definitely on AI exploited vulnerabilities are going to be key. And that's going to make it so that if companies have any known exploitable vulnerabilities, that's going to be an extreme risk because AI is going to be able to exploit those immediately. So that's going to be the type of stuff we're going to see in the headlines here probably in the not too distant future. It's really going to change metrics.
I really like that, the secure, compliant, and resilient as a framework for these dashboards and these metrics. And Paul, your comment around rather than just a sort of static snapshot, thinking about that narrative and story and trends over time and lessons learned is incredibly important. Looking at the poll data that we've got from our audience, we've got 40% that are very confident, and then the 60% are somewhat confident, neutral, or not very confident. So there's still a way to go, but it's good to see that we've got nearly half at very confident. We'll move into our next question here. Let's be a little bit controversial now. Are there any regulations, frameworks, or certifications that organizations place far too much faith in? When achieving compliance, can they create a false sense of security? And Tom, I am going to go to you first with this.
Sure. So I think the two right off the bat are going to be companies that rely on SOC 2 or ISO 27001, audits and certifications based on how, like on a SOC 2, you're able to pick your own controls. It's used for marketing purposes. In ISO 27001, so many companies game that from a scoping perspective that realistically, I really don't feel either are worth the money they're the certificates printed on these days. It's unfortunate, but it's just been gamed. It's a race to the bottom.
Thank you. Anders and Paul, have you got any thoughts around particular regulations that you don't have a lot of faith in?
Well, as Tom just touched upon, regulations that are vague opens up for interpretation and selection, which of course, if you sit on the other end and don't have the skills and experience or time to fully understand it, it becomes a reliability for you. And one of the example of that is a lot of companies from their critical IT vendors, they get tons of SOC 2 reports. None of them have time to review that. So do they really understand how the risk they've outsourced is managed and how that ties into their critical processes? No. Then they send out a questionnaire. So at least those companies that are still relying on kind of the vague framework, not that they couldn't be set up right, they need to take their precautions to make sure that things are actually in place, which again, if you're doing it by human only, it takes forever and no one has time for that. So
for me, it would be any of the kind of standards or certifications which reinforce checkbox mentality of compliance, rather than that how fast you identify and resolve risk and truly understand why you had that risk in the first place. Those certifications that reinforce the checkbox piece are never actually proving that the organization is good at identifying risk and resolving it based on the criticality of that risk in a timely manner. And so if you're buying services from an organization, what you want to truly understand is the risk identification and reduction capability rather than the checkbox capability. And so to me, it's focusing on the certifications that support that kind of risk-based approach rather than checkbox approach.
What certifications come to mind that do take that approach?
So some of them, like, DORA's got elements of checkbox, but it is also thinking about where your risk assessment is of the various different elements. You've got aspects of CMMC. Obviously, part of that has been paused in terms of the third-party piece where a consultation goes on at the moment, and that's obviously very, very new. But then you've got the 27,001 like that Tom refers to, where essentially you can take the controls and you can scope it on a specific area to avoid any areas where you may not look as you will look less favorable. So there are those dimensions where some of those have become, as Tom rightly said, just a checkbox race to the bottom exercise.
Tom, can you talk to our audience a little bit about the STRM project?
Sure. So what the SCF did starting in 2024 was we worked with NIST for their earlier project where they published NIST IR 8477, which is about set theory relationship mapping, so STRM, which is trying to take two disparate frameworks or laws, regulations, frameworks and provide mapping. So it's something a superset of, subset of, equal to, intersects with, or no relationship. So what NIST did, they created essentially the gold standard methodology for how you could take, say, DORA and map it to NIST CSF, or you could even take something like NIST 2 and map it to NIST CSF, and in a very transparent, defendable manner. And what the SCF ended up doing, and we just completed it this last quarter. So we've got, I believe it's 252 different laws, regulations, and frameworks that are transparently published, where all those laws, regulations, and frameworks are mapped, based on a weighting system and, how stuff intersects with to the SCF. So it makes it very defensible from the perspective of if an auditor came and said, well, why are these SCF controls in place to meet a NIST 800-171 requirement? You can actually go see the mappings and the justification and work from there. So it's publicly available. It's open for criticism and refinement. So essentially, it's an open source approach to control crosswalking.
Lovely, thank you, Tom. Looking ahead to 2030, what will the modern CISO's compliance stack look like that it doesn't look like today? This is open to anyone.
I'll kick it off because I do a lot of these kind of conversations of where is GRC going to be in the future. So to me, it's going to likely diverge from today. And we're only talking 4 years away, but the pace of change is rapid. So I think there's a multi kind of points what it will look like. So continuous controls monitoring will be replacing a point in time assessment. Now, a lot of people will say we've got that to a certain degree, but this will become live query, that risk reduction piece I've spoken about already. AI native evidence collection, not AI bolted on. So to me, a lot of tools today got AI with the chatbot layer and with on top of manual workflows. By 2030, that evidence gathering itself, so screenshots, config exports, access logs, will be agentically pooled and validated without human initiating any request in that process. Regulatory horizon scanning will become machine readable. So I know we've got some of that in place already today, but actually new regulatory frameworks come out, they essentially all become a predefined format. We'll bring those in and auto map new obligations to our existing control libraries rather than relying on any legal bulletins or manual gap analysis. So AI is going to really drive some of that capability. Third party, so obviously third party extended enterprise brings a lot of risk to organizations. So rather than point in time assessments, whether that's onboarding and annually, this becomes a continuous monitoring capability, bringing in security posture, financial health, sub-processor chains, all those kind of things. So you're continuously feeding and identifying risk signals. I think you're going to get convergence of compliance, security, and operational elements coming together. We see that more and more now with kind of people coming in with integrated GRC frameworks. But if we think about what matters to the board, is it about being relevant to decision making, not just a CISO just doing his checkbox compliance over here. It's relevant to an organization to make decisions. Control effectiveness, and I know Anders has touched on this to a certain degree already with the SANNOS capability about AI-driven testing checks. We'll cover 100% of a population now, not sample checking. So you could argue some of that is in place now, but I think we're going to see that much more widely. Interestingly for AI, and I'm starting to see this in some discussions with organizations, is about explainability and audit trails, where AI-driven decisions become a compliance category in their own right. So where you've had data provided to you by AI and you've made a decision based on it, need to flag that, understand it, much like IPE and so forth within current kind of SOX style financial controls testing. Board reporting we've talked about will be a live dashboard, not a quarterly pack. And I think we're going to see a talent shift. So we're going to have much fewer compliance analysts doing manual evidence gathering and more compliance engineers that'll be looking at trending. They'll be building, validating automated pipelines from AI and agentic, pulling it all together. Now, I think there's a caveat to all this. It's not going to be a blanket. That's what 2030 is going to look like for every organization. Highly regulated sectors, so financial services, defense, pharmaceuticals, and life sciences, they'll get there faster due to regulatory pressures, while less regulatory industries will likely still be running spreadsheets, frankly, well past 2030.
Well, on that, I agree with everything that Paul said, but I would add just a little bit of an overlay on that one. Is that this information of continuous monitoring and risk scoring isn't going to stay within the organization. This is where a centralized hub like a GRC platform is going to then be reporting to regulatory bodies or to prime contractors. So it's going to be the oversight, like third-party oversight, either from prime contractors or from government agencies, that this information of continuous monitoring will be reported to. That's the trend where it appears the U.S. government is going.
And I think I would go even further. Surprise, being the founder of an AI company, and we already see that now. SANNOS automates 40% of the control execution, moving it from a second line CISO and GRC AI solution towards actually performing with certain guardrails, obviously, with human in the loop. But imagine that you don't even come to office. You have a AI within your GRC platform that is orchestrating everything and getting all the data together. That basically, on a semi-live or live perspective, is both executing first-line activities, checking them, as a second line, and then bringing you in the loop and have access to all the data. I think we will see that much faster. And I think you're right, Paul. It will be the regulated industry that will move to the technology is there now, but companies should use it carefully and make sure it's reliable and trustworthy and set up right, because otherwise it can go horribly wrong, which is of course why AI governance is there.
Thank you. This is the last question because I'm very conscious of time, and I would like you guys to keep this short and sweet if you can. What's one practical action attendees should take in the next 30 days to modernize their compliance program? Paul, we'll kick off with you.
I'd go back to my comment earlier in terms of that kind of blunt version of advice. You've got a mapping and automation problem generally. So fix the control framework mapping once, automate the evidence collection, and prioritize where you assess based on risk.
Thank you. Anders?
Well, 30 days, you don't even need that. Tomorrow, maybe just have a look around in the office, your own work, your colleagues, whether they're CISO, control people, analysts, or compliance people, how much time do they actually use to check, review contracts, open PDF, collect data, and then after that, probably have a kind of a self-diagnostic whether you have a challenge that could be supported with technology, and then build a simple business case.
Finally, Tom.
I would argue go check assumptions. Go look and see if the control set you have addresses your must-have and nice-to-have requirements, and that would be the best way to find out if you're on target or if you're essentially following the wrong direction.
Thank you all. This has been incredibly helpful. This brings the end to our conversation. Thanks to everyone who has joined us live. If you'd like to continue the conversation and maybe work through some of these processes, look at what you currently have and where you want to go, we offer workshops and consultative conversations with the likes of Anders and Paul. Please do visit all of our websites, so CoreStream GRC, SANNOS, and Secure Control Frameworks as well. And make sure to follow us all on LinkedIn for more. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you on our next webinar coming soon. Until then, goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.